as I said, please keep your cameras off and on mute if you are not a panelist or you're not participating in the Q&A, otherwise you will be recorded. So tonight's event is Policing, Whom Do They Protect? And we'll be discussing policing, the pros and cons. We've got fantastic speakers here who will be giving us a great insight into this topic and kind of opening up a discussion for the Green Party and how we could potentially think about our policies and whether they can tie into abolition as well. And so I'm just going to do a bit of an introduction to all of the speakers first before we kick off properly. We have got Megan Hector here, who is the Feminist Greens member, who will be speaking about the history of kind of Black feminist thinking around police abolition. We've got the wonderful Emmanuelle Andrews, who is the policy manager at Liberty, and they're going to be speaking about Liberty's work on serious youth violence and the non-policing solutions to serious youth violence. We've also got Syna here, who is a member of SWARM, which is Sex Workers Advocacy and Resistance Movement, as well as the Sex Workers Union, and they're going to be speaking about sex workers' experiences of policing and how sex work decriminalisation as well as police abolition are linked. And then to introduce myself, I'm Ria Patel, I'm a councillor and I'm the Green Party's Equalities and Diversity Spokesperson. I'm chairing this event. And yeah, so we want to really discuss some more radical strategies for reducing or eliminating the harm that policing causes to our communities and non-policing solutions. So to get started, I'm going to hand over to Megan, who's going to do an introduction to abolition.
Great, thank you, Ria. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming along to this Feminist Greens event. I'm really excited to have you all here. As Ria mentioned, my name is Megan Hector. I'm an Islington Green Party member and I organised this event along with the lovely councillor Ria Patel. So this event is really about people hearing and discussing new ideas, hopefully with an open mind and a sense of hope and possibility about the kind of world that we could live in if we organise things differently. That might sound like an oddly hopeful opening statement to some of you, as we know that the reason why so much attention is being paid to policing in recent times is because of scandals repeatedly coming to light, ranging from racist messages in police WhatsApp groups, to sexual harassment, to extreme sexual and domestic violence and murder committed by serving police officers. So the coverage of these scandals has shone an important light on the culture in the Metropolitan Police and other police forces in the UK, a culture that's been repeatedly found to be pervaded with racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, and ableism. I think it seems common sense to many of us that this culture influences how police officers carry out their work, as well as their propensity to abuse their powers by committing violent crimes against vulnerable or marginalised people. But I wanted to organise this event not just to talk about individual police officers abusing their powers or using their powers to commit crimes and cover up for each other, although those are very important topics for discussion. The purpose of this event is also not about painting every single police officer as a nasty or abusive individual. I know many people who are or who have been police officers who are kind and caring on an interpersonal level. But one of the key things I would like to talk about is the function that policing plays in our society, what the work of being a police officer requires people to do, and the effect of normal everyday policing on our lives and what it's possible for all of us to do, how it's possible for us to live. So in order to do that, I will start with a brief description of how the modern form of policing came about. And pretty much everything that I'm going to say in the rest of this talk is covered, as we've discussed, by lots of Black feminist thinkers, police and prison and police abolitionist thinkers over the past sort of many decades, including Angela Davis, Marion Carver, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and more contemporary writers like R.V. Sarah Day and Shanice McBean, Gracie May Bradley. So at the end, I'll be sort of waving some books around that I would recommend to everyone, and we will probably send out a sort of suggested reading list from our speakers today as well. But yes, so in terms of the history of policing, to make a brief comment about the US firstly, in the US, the institution of policing evolved out of slave patrols. So they were local groups of armed men who patrolled the towns and roads to look for and capture escaped slaves and return them to their owners. After slavery was abolished, these new police forces took a different tactic, and they arrested Black people on spurious charges in order to imprison them and then put them to work back in the same fields as prisoners. But in the UK, we have a slightly different history. So many of you might know the Metropolitan Police was established in 1829 by then Home Secretary Robert Peel. You may have heard about the Peelian Principles, which are 9 short principles for maintaining police legitimacy and effectiveness and enabling policing by consent, so the consent of the public. In his book, The End of Policing, the author Alex Vitale explains that the idea of policing by consent came about not because the police had the best interests of the public in mind, but because they and the government realised that the new industrial working class was so huge that it wasn't actually possible to police them by violence or by force. And when they did try violent methods, these only backfired and made revolutions seem more likely. So this made it necessary for the public to consent to policing and for ordinary people to get involved with normalising policing, in order for the police and the government to maintain social control over these potentially unruly cohorts of society. And this enabled the government to use policing to prevent working class people and migrants from rising up in revolt to change the economic system, which was causing the conditions of poverty and destitution that they were living in, and exploitation as well. So if we fast forward to the present day, we'll see that these origins of policing are actually very relevant to what's happening now. To take a broader view, there are lots of things about our society, to me, that don't make sense. There are over 1 million empty homes in the UK, but we also have a severe housing and homelessness crisis. We're one of the richest countries in the world, but millions of children in the UK are growing up in poverty and destitution. Inequality and unequal distribution of necessary resources runs throughout our society. We're also facing the imminent threat of climate change, but our government and our politicians, outside of the Green Party, of course, are failing to act with anything like the vision or urgency that we need to avert climate disaster. So what I'll suggest is that policing is one of the ways in which we all as the public are prevented from fundamentally changing the way that our society works in order to resolve these paradoxes that I've just mentioned. So when you look through history at times when people have come together en masse to rise up to try to change the conditions of society that are oppressing them, every single time the police are there attempting to put down this struggle with violence and to maintain the inherently violent status quo. So we can see this from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s civil rights movement, which was consistently violently policed to try to stop the movement. We can see from the miners' strikes in the UK in the 1980s, which were also violently policed to try to stop the strikes in order to keep the balance of power in favour of the company bosses and the government. Additionally, many of us will be aware of the Spy Cops scandal, where a number of undercover police officers spent years in fraudulent relationships with left-wing activists in order to collect information on their activism. Our former Green Party leader, Sian Berry, was found to be being monitored and surveilled by the Metropolitan Police's anti-extremism unit. Nowadays, climate protests demanding our government take urgent action have been violently broken up by the police, and people are now being sentenced to prison for peaceful protest. So when people take direct action to try to prevent things which cause immense harm to individuals, to communities, or to the planet, such as by lying in the road to prevent a deportation flight to Rwanda taking off, or physically blocking the entrance to a weapons factory, or trying to physically prevent the building of a new oil pipeline, policing is what brings that action to a stop. I would suggest that these examples demonstrate that the primary aim of the police is not to keep us safe or to protect our communities or our planet. It's to defend the interests of the government and property owners, the people for whom capitalism works really well. Hopefully, lots of us on this call would agree that our current economic system doesn't work for most of us. It values creating ever-increasing profits for a very small number of rich people, far over and above meeting the basic needs of the vast majority of the population. This system, capitalism, is one of the root causes of the climate crisis, but it's also one of the root causes of the horrendous poverty and inequality that we have in the UK. And policing helps to maintain these social and economic systems which keep people in poverty by preventing people from refusing these systems and from demanding change. Not only that, policing then enforces the criminalisation of people for their responses to the poverty that they're living in, whether it's stealing, selling drugs, sleeping rough, or doing sex work. I would suggest that policing is a repressive force of social control, which prevents the social and economic change that we desperately need and maintains these systems which create poverty and harm. I'm just going to move on quickly to talk about reform and ideas about reform, which is what a lot of us talk about a lot of the time when we're talking about policing. So many good, well-meaning people have been struggling for decades to reform policing. And it's kind of a cliche, but it is the definition of madness to keep trying the same thing and expecting that eventually it will have a different outcome. The Macpherson report in 1999 was the first report to brand the Metropolitan Police institutionally racist and to make recommendations for how the force could rectify this situation. Nearly 25 years later, the dial may have moved slightly, but we are still in a situation where Dame Louise Casey's 2023 report on the Met similarly found the force to be institutionally racist, as well as institutionally misogynistic, homophobic, transphobic, and ableist. So one of my questions that I ask people is, for those of us who might be hoping that meaningful reform is possible, how long will we wait for reform to work? How many more decades? At what point do we accept that trying to make reforms with a view to continuing the existence of the police is a doomed struggle, and that we need to start talking more loudly, more publicly about the fact that reform has failed, and we need to move on now to focusing on different ways of protecting people and communities from harm? Measures like improving vetting and better training can be valuable, but ultimately, in my view, there is no amount of vetting that can totally prevent abusers from getting into the police force, because abusers are very good at lying. So better disciplinary procedures would also be good. I think it seems obvious to most of us that if someone has been abusive or even violent towards another person, they should, of course, be removed from the police force. But at the point of disciplinary procedures, the harm has already been done, and that's not good enough. For me, the ultimate problem is that we have this gang of people who have the power to exercise coercive control over other people. And that is a situation that will always attract abusers. Then there are the calls to increase the diversity of police officers. So as Arvia Day and Shanice McBean write in their book, Abolition Revolution, which I'm going to wave around because this is my top recommendation for everyone to read, they said, demands to increase the number of Black or women officers ultimately serves to protect police legitimacy. It reframes police violence and institutional oppression as a product of a lack of representation and diversity. In reality, oppression and violence are a necessary function of police power under capitalism. So on another point, when people call for more community police officers in order to somehow rebuild trust between the police and communities, I think we have to ask ourselves, what are those officers going to be doing in our communities if we had more of them? They will be stop and searching disproportionately young people of colour as part of our failed war on drugs. They will be strip searching children in our schools and our communities, which is a form of state-sanctioned sexual violence. They will be giving fines to people sleeping rough. They will be harassing sex workers to move them into more isolated areas, which is more dangerous. And they will be assisting in deporting people. These are some of the essential fundamental functions of policing in our society. So, probably not shockingly to everyone on this call, I personally don't believe that policing can be reformed to the point where the institution continues to exist, but is no longer causing harm in our communities. This is particularly because of what I've explored throughout this talk so far, which is that policing defends and maintains systems and societal conditions that cause harm to people. So what I would like to see is an intentional project of police abolition, whereby we go about focusing our time and resources on solving the root causes of the problems that the police are currently being used to respond to. And in doing so, we can reduce the numbers of police officers and also reduce people's perception that we need the police in order to keep ourselves and our communities safe. So the big question, what is police abolition? Abolition doesn't mean getting rid of the police tomorrow and changing absolutely nothing else about society. In fact, it actually means the opposite of that. Abolition is about a fundamental transformation and reorganization of society so that everyone's basic needs are met. No one is living in or threatened with poverty or homelessness, or abandoned to struggle alone with their mental illness or substance use. Abolition is actually a really hopeful, creative project of building a new world where we prevent harm as much as possible, and where our responses to harm that does still happen don't involve inflicting more harm through policing and prisons. Abolition can include reforming institutions like policing, but through what we call non-reformist reforms, which is a phrase used by many people, including Mariam Kaba. These are reforms which reduce the power and legitimacy of policing. So, for example, non-reformist reforms which actually reduce police powers can include withdrawing lethal tools like tasers and pepper spray, scrapping police programs and infrastructure which discriminate against or disproportionately target particular groups, like the Prevent program or the Gangs Matrix, and rejecting or repealing laws which seek to increase police power, such as Section 60 of the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act 1994, which allows a police officer to stop and search someone without any reasonable suspicion that they've committed a crime. But alongside this, what are some of the ways that we could start now to prevent harm in the first place rather than criminalising it? We could demand to have investment in mental health first aid teams in every community, like first responders, so that the police are not relied on to respond to mental health crises. We can insist on proper funding for the NHS so that everyone is able to access help with substance use, for example, in a way that works for them at any time. We could insist on a revolution in sex and relationship education to ensure that messages of consent and a refusal of misogyny or violence against women are embedded and normalised in everyone's lives and in our culture. We can trial community groups which respond when someone is experiencing sexual or domestic violence, so that no one is trapped in a violent situation with nowhere to go or no one to help them leave. We could demand a universal basic income so that no one is driven to crime by poverty or desperation. Most importantly, we must build communities where we expect to be deeply involved in the work of caring for each other and ensuring each other's safety and survival, but also our well-being and happiness. That's all for me. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that thorough introduction to policing abolition. I think what you're talking about, particularly kind of towards the end there, about the transformation of society, is so much of what we in the Green Party are looking to achieve. And so it's really exciting that we could really try to tie these two things together, because we do talk about how we'd like to see a different society, and there's so many different aspects to that, and policing is one part of that, but also in terms of community care and solidarity. And I hope that we can explore some of those terms or phrases later on in this talk. But for now, I'm going to move over to Emmanuelle Andrews, who is the policy manager at Liberty. Liberty is a fantastic organisation, if you haven't heard of them before, doing amazing stuff on human rights, both in court, government, throughout society. But today we're going to be talking about youth violence and serious youth violence. And Liberty has written a fantastic kind of guide booklet on this called Holding Your Own, and I really get it up. I really recommend you having a read through this. I know that lots of members in London have really been raving about this, so recommend you also read through it. But without me waffling on, I'm going to pass on to Emmanuelle now.
Thank you so much. And just before I begin, I'm going to try and share my screen, which not very techy at all, unfortunately. So I was trying to do it during Megan's presentation, which was fantastic, and I still have not figured it out. So I've got two laptops, but I'm hoping I'll be able to do it. If not, I'll do it on one, but it may just mean I have to weirdly look down, which would be a bit of a shame. Okay, no, I'm gonna...
No pressure. In the meantime, I'm going to say that if anyone has questions, do start thinking about that, because we will have a section about 30 minutes towards the end for a Q&A, and we really hope that this can open up the start of a discussion within the Green Party about our policing policies and abolition and how we might want to incorporate that. So yeah, do have a think. I know that I've got questions that have come up from Megan's initial talk, so I'm sure plenty will come up. But yeah, do make a note of them. Are you ready to go, Emmanuelle?
I'm going to try with my main laptop. Sorry.
That's all right, no worries. I've also popped in a link to the chat to the Holding Your Own guide so that you can read through it in your own time. You can also, I believe, get a booklet from somewhere, but there is a digital copy on that link.
Okay, let's try this.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, great. The embarrassing moment when you have to see everyone's kind of desktop back to screen. Slideshow. Amazing. Okay, right. Almost done. It's so much nicer. We can start a presentation much more smoothly, but here we are. Well, firstly, thank you so much for having me. And Megan, that was such a brilliant opening. I feel like half of the work has already been done. Most of my presentation is actually confirming a lot of that, but I think I really appreciate you opening with that context. And I think one of the reasons why I think it's so important we're here today is because political education is so vital. So even though I'm sure we'll be singing from the same hymn sheet with much of what we say, that is only a good thing. And I think hearing things in different ways, even if they might be kind of coming from the same root, is really important. So as Megan just discussed, and as I will illuminate further in this conversation, I'm going to be talking about non-policing solutions to what gets called serious youth violence. I guess to start with a kind of personal kind of grounding of what I understand abolition to mean, I see the work of abolition as a demand to abolish the conditions which give rise to harm, a demand to abolish the harms which justify the need for police. And so for me, it involves a vision for the world in which we don't need police, we don't need prisons, we don't need the criminal justice system. A world in which people's material needs are cared for, and a world in which we can all flourish. And I think Megan has already put that so beautifully in all that she said. As is really apparent as well, this idea is not new. It's come from numerous places, it's global, it's intergenerational. But thinking about alternatives to policing, or perhaps a kind of more clunky sentence, alternative solutions to the problems that policing allegedly tries to solve, is in many ways new for Liberty. So in the short time I have with you, I'm going to run through some of Liberty's policing work. I'm going to talk about the wider context of policing. I'm going to bring in serious youth violence, what gets called serious youth violence. I'm going to talk about the Holding Our Own campaign, and I'm going to briefly talk about what you can do next. And I've also got some resources as well. So for those that don't know, Liberty is a human rights and civil liberties organisation. And since Liberty's inception, we have fought against police brutality. We were literally set up in the 1930s in response to brutal attempts to suppress hunger march protesters. And we challenge injustice, we defend freedom, and campaign to make sure everyone in the UK is treated fairly. So one of our central demands when it has come to policing historically has been to roll back police powers. And a lot of that work has been firefighting. We've been saying this is what we don't want. We've been condemning existing government policies. And I think we can all appreciate that given current parliamentary arithmetic, it's very difficult to do otherwise. This is necessary and urgent work. British policing is in crisis. And as many of our communities know, it always has been. But in the last few years in particular, we've seen a series of shameful scandals that have brought police into public disrepute, I'd say, because it's not that this hasn't been known by many people, by many communities, but it has been made more public. And that, of course, is because of the brilliant work that campaigners, families at the front end of injustice, at the sharpest end of violence, have been campaigning for, fighting for, desperately seeking to be uncovered for decades. From the death of Chris Carver, an unarmed Black man who was shot dead by police while he was driving a car, to the strip search of child Q, a Black schoolgirl who was strip searched whilst on her period at school, to the conversations that have been happening, perhaps to a newer part of the public, in particular white people, white women, as a result of awful, horrific cases of misogyny and violence against white women and girls. Again, these aren't new cases. It's just that they have been amplified in a way that we've never really seen done before. So from the murder of Sarah Everard to the uncovering of a police officer as one of Britain's most prolific sexual offenders. These examples have amplified what many people have known, and that is that policing is a violent institution. It's embedded with racism and sexism, homophobia, and so on. Because of all these revelations, and because of the hard work that many communities have been doing for a long time, we are having a national conversation about policing, and the role of police has been scrutinised and challenged at an unprecedented scale. So you'll see in these pictures Baroness Casey and the really important the Casey review. But at the same time as these really important scandals have been uncovered and this national conversation has meant that we've had these reports, we've not seen the changes that we might anticipate. And in fact, far from seeing the powers stripped from the police, what we're seeing instead are further powers granted. The recent crime and justice bill that was published, that was announced in the King's Speech this month, is just one example of the government turning to increasing police powers to tackle so-called homelessness, antisocial behaviour. Political parties across the spectrum, as we know, are also battling it out to be the party of law and order. So if we know that these high-profile deaths are only the sharpest end of a continuum of policing, we also know that the harms of policing reverberate in numerous, more subtle, more everyday ways. So whether that is the stop and searches that disproportionately target Black people, the facial recognition technology that is being scaled out across the country to target people struggling to survive amidst the cost of living crisis, to the joint enterprise convictions that criminalize young people based on who their friends are, where they live, what music they listen to. We have to continue grappling with the harms that policing does. How do we fight against the expansion of police powers in the name of security? How do we push against the insistence on policing as the solutions to society's ills that has seen the real needs of our communities neglected for so long? How do we carve out space for us to build a vision for the world that we do want? I know that Liberty has been doing so much firefighting that really important alternative visioning work has been much more difficult to do. But the Holding Our Own campaign, which was a coalition between 9 organisations working across human rights, youth services, racial justice, mental health, drugs policing, and numerous others, is one example of how we can build support around non-policing solutions to what gets called serious youth violence. It's one of the many examples of groups coming together to push back against the things that are harming our communities and saying that we don't want what we don't want, while simultaneously building alternatives for a vision of the world we do want and the care that our communities so desperately need. So when I talk about serious youth violence, I mean a term that broadly refers to harm inflicted on young people by other young people, resulting in serious injury or death. It is both an imagined and a real issue, and it's that duplicity that we used to support our analysis in the Holding Our Own project. So what do we mean by that? What do we mean that serious youth violence, or what gets called serious youth violence? I always do my little speech marks very low down, but I am doing that to really illustrate the kind of stickiness around that term. But what do we mean by this imagined and real understanding of serious violence? And why was Liberty interested in working on it and trying to tackle it and trying to bring these organisations together to respond to it? Well, we notice that the issue of serious youth violence plays a particular role in public consciousness. As an imagined issue, it is constructed by politicians and the mainstream press as a justification for the continued over-policing of Black communities and as a lever to call for ever more police powers. And so when you Google the term knife crime, you'll see these types of headlines at the bottom of the screen there. We know that the government, the opposition, the political establishment, the mainstream media all perpetuate a narrative around serious youth violence, one that is racist and ignorant to its root causes, and also a complete and deliberate, I'd argue, misreading, misrepresentation, and manipulation of the evidence surrounding the issue. So the issue as a problem plays a specific role in policing and the criminal justice system, but also in the imagination of the public. So by tapping into these fears, predominantly of the white middle classes in our cities and beyond, and defining safety as safety from thugs and gangs, and we all know the racialized and class narratives that underpin such terms, it situates anyone that tries to critique these frames as part of the problem. And I'm sure that this is also going to be something that gets picked up when we bring the conversation onto sex work. As soon as you bring up or question what's really going on with these issues that policing and the criminal justice system or the government use as kind of wedge issues, you're often, flicked away as not only a nuisance, but harmful yourself as someone or a group of people trying to push back and uncover the ways in which these narratives are used in public consciousness and discourse. So to be absolutely clear, every life lost by serious youth violence is a tragedy. Serious violence is real then in how it's government neglect, runaway inequality, poverty, and a myriad of other factors that have created a situation in which violence is occurring and young people are experiencing serious harm, including death, as a result. That is a human rights issue. And yet the policies being introduced in response to the situation fail both to respect human rights and to tackle the root causes of the issue. And due to the harm that traditional responses create in their wake, they thereby exacerbate the very problems they claim to solve. So this shows up in police practices, tools, and technologies like the gangs violence matrix. It shows up in joint enterprise convictions. It shows up in the ways in which people are criminalized because of rap lyrics and many other things. So confronting serious youth violence is therefore, as Shanice McBean and Avia Day articulate in their book, Abolition, Revolution, as much a struggle against the physical manifestation of violent institutions, so the cuffing, the caging, the death, but also an ideological struggle to dismantle the narratives and ideas used to uphold them. So with all of that in mind, how do we respond to the social issue that is serious youth violence? I think, as I've already alluded to, it starts by situating serious youth violence amidst the compendium of harms that are done to marginalized communities as part of the broader violence affecting communities. That involves understanding what the root causes are. And when we realize what those are, we understand that police and the criminal justice system can never solve those problems. So some of those root causes, as I've mentioned, poverty, exclusion, the harms of drugs policing, many other numerous issues that have been researched for and evidenced for years, and by some really surprising people. The Violence Reduction Unit, for example, states really clearly that poverty and violence are inextricably linked. And understanding that also helps us to make another shift and reframe the reality of safety. So I put two quotes up here that come from the Holding Our Own guide, and that were based on some research and work that we did with young people. The one on the left, when I have the man down with me, I feel safe, I don't worry about nothing, was a really beautiful articulation of a conversation that we had with some young people from Art Against Knives, who, when we really pressed with them, you know, what makes you feel safe? We started to uncover that it is in their friendship groups that they feel safe. And we basically just started to really grapple with what the term safety does as a term. And that really informed the way that we introduced the Holding Our Own guide. So you might be wondering, how do we then still respond to the issue of serious youth violence? How do we respond to the now? And one way in which we can do that is by understanding what harm reduction actually looks like. Because the responses that the police and government and criminal justice system so often come up with are things like stop and search. We know, on the one hand, that stop and search rarely succeeds in its stated aims. So it doesn't work. But meanwhile, it does immense harm in the process. So when you expand your understanding of harm, you're able to better analyze what the policing practices that are supposed to be about harm reduction, that, you know, the taking the knife off one young person they like to bandy about, might have this impact, but the big impact on that young person is this big. I mean, that's just a really small kind of trying to express it. But when you understand harm like that, you also can understand and reframe what harm reduction practically looks like. So the demands for today that we used in the guide really speak to the fact that policing, the criminal justice system, these kind of carceral logics are present in institutions beyond the police, because policing moves through institutions that don't kind of have the same uniform as itself. So from school exclusions to dismantling harmful practices in traditional mental health systems, it's really an array of different demands. And the reason why we've situated them as demands for today is both to grapple with the fact that, one, these are things that we could do today, but two, they also are things that do have that kind of instant, or could have that instant, reduction in serious violence. And that is something that people that are interested in abolition are often kind of met back with, you know, but what about the now? What about the now? The demands for tomorrow, however, also really start to build on that vision that is so important. It really starts to show how multidisciplinary this work is, how this work is for everyone, whether you're a nurse, a youth worker, a climate justice campaigner, a parent, or a teacher, whether you can, you know, open up your spaces to create healing-centered, racially literate spaces for young people. The demands in the guide are really life-affirming. They center Black joy, friendship, and creativity, and the hopefulness that can come when we work together to imagine and campaign on a platform of dismantling oppressive institutions and building pathways for radical care, radical change, grounded in community care, healing justice, and love. And that's really important because the work, and I promise I'm finishing, but the work of this work can't be done alone. And we also can't utilize or repurpose the logics of carcerality in our work. So that means, you know, using all of our tools, centering joy, centering love and care. And finally, I just wanted to briefly talk about how you can get involved. The first thing I will say is read the Holding Our Own guide, of course. There are lots of resources on non-reformist reforms I would recommend, and I can send this slideshow to everyone afterwards. And also these kind of readings and podcasts. But really practically, you can refuse the quick fixes to structural issues in society. We don't have to take as valid the idea that, you know, investing more in police or upping sentencing is the solution that we need. We can demand that responding to the root causes will help the now, and they will help the tomorrow. And I would also encourage you to start thinking about the ways in which carceral practices show up in other parts of your life, because when you start tracing those threads together, you realize that this work is something that cannot be done alone, and it has to be done in conjunction with other parts of your life. Thank you so much. I know I've probably overrun, and I'm really sorry. I'm also a little bit ill, so I know it's a bit nasally. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think that was a really thorough kind of introduction to Holding Our Own Guide, and I really recommend everyone go away and read that. I just wanted to pick up on a few points before we move on to the next speaker. I think that there was a really key point about how policing really exacerbates the issues that policing is meant to be solving, and the underlying issues are really not being tackled. And I think that's something as Greens that we do understand in our policies, and we do try to kind of really tackle the root causes, at least kind of thinking from being a councillor in Croydon, representing the town centre. I think that's something that really resonates with me, and it's such an important thing to be pushing for as councillors, kind of, I guess, using the terms like public health within the council setting, but fighting for kind of those types of solutions. Also in terms of school exclusions, and really pushing for, exclusions to be banned, basically. There's a campaign called No More Exclusions, which I recommend checking out. But I do hope that councillors were taking some notes, and if you're not as well, kind of a campaigner in your area hoping to be a councillor, watch this back, take some notes, read through the Holding Your Own Guide, because there are some really practical points that we can already start to implement. And I like how the guide is split into kind of today and tomorrow type of kind of visions. So the next speaker is Syna. I don't know if people know this, but one of the main reasons I joined the Green Party is because of its policy on sex work, and the fact that we commit to the full decriminalisation of sex work. But there is still so much further we need to go to get to this point, and the link to policing is definitely something that needs exploring within this. So over to you, Syna.
Hi, I'm Syna, they, them pronouns. If you know me by a different name and you're on this call, I have many names, so thank you for not connecting the dots. But with one of my other hats on, I do drug policy stuff. With today's hat on, I'm going to just be talking about the sex work stuff, or at least this spiel. I will integrate drug stuff in Q&A if it's helpful, because there's obviously a lot of overlap between sex workers and people who use drugs and policing experiences. So all of us, for the reasons covered by Megan and Emmanuelle beautifully, we all, for all of our sake, need police abolition, and we all have a role to play in bringing about police abolition. I'm going to speak kind of more specifically to the role that sex workers have and are already playing in getting to abolition, in the hopes that it also kind of practically identifies some of the obstacles, but also some of the opportunities and strategies towards achieving abolition. So the reason sex workers so urgently need and are already experiencing a lot of the calls for abolition is because we're criminalized, right? But not just default because of the status of sex work. And the sort of criminalization of sex work in the UK is a complicated one. There's like pieces that are criminalized, there's pieces that aren't. It's not as black or white as other places where there's full criminalization. I won't go through all of the details of the legal models in depth, but you can find really good resources right now on the Decrim Now socials, where there's an active campaign starting to talk about different models of legalization versus decriminalization and what they mean. So I'll save you that spiel for now. We can come back to it in Q&A. But all to say, the things that bring most folks to sex work is the need for money to survive, right? It's not a unique feature to sex workers' lives. It's a feature of all of our lives. But many people who sex work do so because other avenues to making money to live have been foreclosed to you, especially like formal ones. And the reasons that they've been foreclosed to you is usually through different experiences of forms of oppression. Often we know that the most unifying one in the UK is around gender. So people who are in the sex trade predominantly experience some form of gender oppression, either as women or as different gender diverse people. So there's a shared experience usually of being impacted by patriarchy in some way, shape, or form. Many people are racialized, many people are disabled, many people are carers to either children or disabled people or both, but experience unique barriers due to the fact that they're carers with entering other sectors. And so all of us already with those experiences also have likely experienced or in communities that have experienced adverse, like harms from policing. It's upfront incentive for us because many of us are experiencing the violence of policing as a form of social control already before we've even entered the sex work industry, and it's only doubled down upon when sex working. And those two things are interrelated. Cops are also not naive to the fact that many of us have different immigration statuses or already have criminal records that have like foreclosed other employment to us or so on and so forth when they interact with us. That is a known facet of our life, and I'll come to that in a little bit in terms of how sex workers are impacted by the current laws. So we have this relationship to policing that we've had for some time that is pretty negative. We already know very acutely that police don't actually exist to keep us safe. They exist as a form of social control, and we know that we are socially undesirable and like experience that control in various ways. We also are like highly stigmatized, right? And so even when police aren't approaching us because we've broken a law that they're here to enforce against, police are also carrying that stigma against sex workers with them and using that accordingly. So I guess an example I could give of this, sorry for being a little all over the place, I'm trying not to repeat too much. There is something nice about repeating concepts, but I'm also mindful that it's getting late into the evening and I'm also a little sleep deprived. Is that when police do what they call welfare checks, so like sort of the embodiment of the myth of policing, like we're here to be helpful, we're here to make sure people are working safely. What happens in practice is actually usually the criminalization of some or everyone, or at the very least, like a full disruption of a day of work and a loss of income for everyone involved. For folks who don't know what a welfare check is, in any space where multiple sex workers are working in this country, it can be considered a brothel. And anywhere that's a brothel, police can just go in and do a welfare check. And this is described really well in a recent English Collective of Prostitutes report, Proceed Without Caution, which maybe we can link in the chat because it's super helpful, where I derive a lot of my most recent facts from. But police have this practice of welfare checks. They go in, it means no one can work effectively. There's no work that can happen. Clients aren't going to enter the premises. Police are often intimidating and making folks feel unsafe. And they're also just collecting information about you and your workplace. They're getting to know your face and your name in ways that make, like, it's an intimidation at its like most mild and like actively leads to like arrests or cautions or charges at worst for folks, right? And other forms of violence as well. We don't have great data on the outcomes of different welfare checks right now, other than really limited figures. But we know comparably in Ireland, a lot of the arrests that happen inside of these venues, the vast majority happen to women who are non-Irish nationals, who get charged as traffickers, and this often leads to removal from the country. So the sort of myth of policing continue that they're there to arrest the big bad traffickers, the pimps who are exploiting vulnerable women. Actually, it just breaks up our workplaces and is like used also as an additional immigration tool against us when there's quite a lot of us that have different immigration statuses. So again, through all of these and like this report and many other resources in this country really nicely detail the different barriers that sex workers experience. We've just all already known the reality of policing. And so sex workers collectively, as they organize through different bodies, both work to challenge and resist these sort of police as an oppressive apparatus of the state, but also build their own safety tools, like in place of what the police pretend to promise to community generally. And so simultaneously, we are trying to like highlight and advocate against the unique ways that like police put everyone in danger in our communities. And also saying, these are the alternatives, the things that we're actively already doing in order to stay safe, be it like check-in groups for one another, you know, like mutual aid projects, so on and so forth around the country. And like doing those things concurrently. And then also experiencing criminalization for doing those things. So the brothel piece I just mentioned, us gathered in a space to do mutual aid, if it involves us supporting each other with our working conditions, we could be seen as trafficking one another, or that space that we could be coexisting in could be criminalized as a brothel, as a workplace, even if we're not actively working within it. We can't have each other as roommates. Like you know, our like housing can be jeopardized, and so on and so forth. So our mutual aid projects, our ability to survive is actively criminalized, well beyond the sort of like false parameters of where we actually work. And then also when we resist, or when we try to build the structures to do resistance, it is also criminalized. And this is not, again, an experience unique to sex workers, and it should come as no surprise that potentially radical bodies that like aggregate to challenge the state are disrupted by the police. But for instance, one site where the union has been quite active for sex workers is in strip clubs. And the reason for that is in most strip clubs around the country, you are self-employed if you dance there. And there are often contracts that exist between yourself as the self-employed person in the club that are very exploitative. Like they're just horrible, misogynistic, terrible documents. If you ever really want to be shocked by the state of a document, just look at a strip club contract. It'll say things about your demeanor and how you have to show up presenting for work and all sorts of stuff that just is not acceptable in any other workplace. But the sort of fun trick of it all is these types of contracts and the conditions that are put on supposedly self-employed people are actually like working conditions that would be said to give you confer you worker status in the UK, which is a different employment status to being self-employed. It's not quite the same as being a full employee, but it confers you some rights, some limited rights, which would be really helpful for us. In order to gain those though, like you have to get recognition through the legal system of this country. And so the unions have ongoing battles. We've won some of these battles where getting collectives of workers in a local area these rights, but it's incredibly difficult, right? And it involves a series of workers who, as we've already covered, are usually already experiencing multiple axes of oppression, coming together and having to navigate collectively the legal system of this country, which is very hostile to sex workers. On top of all of that, in the meanwhile, while you're still working at the club, which if they obviously catch this, right, like they'll be antagonistic towards, and because you are not a recognized worker, you are not able to benefit from trade union victimization laws, as narrow as they already are. So you have no protections between yourself and your employer, and you have very limited other avenues of making income. And then if you are experiencing abusive practices in your workplace before you have these rights, your only option, depending on the scale of the abuse, is effectively to call the police. You cannot register a complaint with ACAS if you are a stripper who is self-employed in these clubs. You do not have recourse via the tribunal system. At best, like, and we hear dangerous practices all the time. The thing that you're told you can do is call the police. And what happens when the police come to the club that is hurting you or hurting your coworkers? Your club either faces no consequences because, I mean, how serious do the police take these calls? Or your club gets shut down, their license is put in jeopardy for operating. And so then you just have no place of work, and neither do your colleagues as well. So a lot of the ways in which we attempt to organize are also being like actively thwarted by the state. And so it's a constant challenge to sort of evolve and keep up. But in all of this, the police are like one of the main active mechanisms to jeopardizing the really basic struggles we have to try and build, you know, basic working rights, basic livable conditions. At every opportunity, the police, they are the main barrier. They are the people that enact the laws that are against us being able to survive. And so I guess I would leave it there for now. I'm happy to answer the sort of questions, but just to highlight the ways in which police like actively work against already concentrated oppressed communities. With that.
Amazing. Thank you so much. You covered so many issues in such a short period of time that sex workers face. So that was like really, really beneficial. Thank you so much. I did pop in the chat some links throughout everyone speaking. So there's a petition there that you can sign, but I'm also just going to pop in a template letter by Hookers Against Hardship campaign that you can send to your MPs. There you go. So we're going to move on to questions now. If people want to raise their hand to be able to ask questions, I will come to you. Yeah, okay, let's go to Ben first.
Hi, I'm Ben. I'm from Burnt Oak. We've got a local park which is quite near the tube station. The front entrance is being redesigned. There's a company called the Designing Out Crime Team. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they go around taking away benches, So in my park, there's a wall that people like to sleep behind, and there's benches which apparently pimps sit on. It doesn't feel so safe sitting around there, to be honest. And they sit on the steps and they drink, the men, the homeless men or whatever. They sit on this, they're going to get rid of the steps. So I was just wondering your advice on how to resist these designing out crime teams, because they also want to remove mature trees, which are in the way of line of sight. And as a man, obviously, I cannot speak to women's safety in the park.
That's a really good question, and links again to things that I've seen happening in Croydon. So I don't know if anyone would like to take that question on first. Yeah, Syna.
I'm thinking as I'm speaking, so maybe I shouldn't have put my hand up so fast, but I might speak from my drugs hat and not my sex work hat, but a little bit of both. Just to say that, like, one of the ways I find the urge to displace undesirable people as the sort of solution to problems is to point out all the other better ways that problems could be addressed. So rather than taking away steps, like actually just creating other seating publicly in the area, adding more lighting if you're worried about lines of sight. Like, I think that there's other ways to just actually like be generative also to the people that are already there. And one of the things that I flagged with the sort of like public health drugs hat on is for both sex workers and for many people who are using drugs, including people who are publicly drinking, really, like when you displace people, like they are at greater likelihood of death. And that is because you separate people from their social networks of people, like what was said earlier from Emmanuelle, like people feel safe when they're with their friends. Friends are the actual meaningful way that most of us experience safety in our life, not police. And so when you take away the structures that people can even be with others, one of the options might just be that same group of people, it just is now a number of individuals drinking alone instead. And so then there's no one to look after you when you become unresponsive, right? And we know that where hostile architecture crops up the most in the States, we see more overdose deaths because there's not people around you to respond when you become unresponsive, and we have such a toxic drug supply. That same drug supply is now coming here very quickly, and so we will have a very similar situation soon in the UK, which I don't think anyone is prepared for. And similarly, we know this with sex workers, that when PSPOs come into play in this country, that when similar policing tactics are used in the United States that disrupt outdoor sex working, people just end up working isolated in areas alone. And they are more susceptible to violence. You don't have the network of friends that check in with you or that warn you about specific license plates. You just lose avenues to actual meaningful safety. And so I would maybe highlight those ways to say that, like, doing many of these tactics, separating out these people, like, who cares about the safety of the people that were sitting for the steps?
Yeah, really good answer. I think something else I would add is that you're not tackling the root cause of why they are drinking there by just getting rid of the steps. And so in Croydon, in the town centre, I know I keep talking about Croydon, I'm sorry, but in the town centre they've introduced a public space protection order, PSPO, for street drinkers, and all that's done is basically meant that people don't drink in the streets in the town centre, but instead just around the outskirts. And the problem still continues, and no one is actually getting the right support that they should be kind of being offered, rather than, you know, criminalizing them for drinking. And also another problem or an issue that I raised is that it's fine for people to be drinking on the streets. Like, if you think about pubs that have seating outside and things, like if you can afford to pay for the alcohol in the restaurants, it's okay. But if you're drinking a tinny on the road with your friends, that's not okay. And that links again to what is antisocial behavior, and who is seen to be antisocial, who can take up public space, and who is okay to exist publicly. And yeah, it's so much I can go on about this, but I'm going to stop. Nama, I think you had your hand up.
Yes, yeah, thank you. That was a very informative talk. Thank you very much, Emmanuelle and Syna, for that. So I was just, my main question is about policing as part of a bigger organization, which is called the state. And policing evolved at the same time as schooling. So what was happening at the home, where you had like domestic control of people at home. So you had the nuclear family, the dad and the mother, controlling the the home environment, the police, the school, and the hospital were controlling the public sphere. So so how can you dismantle one thing out of this complex system that consists of the nuclear family and the state institutions, and expect that to work and not expect it to be replaced by something more aggressive, similar to what happened, for example, in the United States, where slavery was abolished to create the prison industrial complex, or what is it called, Clause 13, which overtook from slavery and reimagined or recreated slavery in a worse manner through the carceral system. So how can you do that? How can you abolish it completely without dismantling this whole system?
Good question, Megan.
Yeah, thank you for that fantastic question, and I completely agree with everything you said. The answer is obviously you can't. You do have to abolish all of the other terrible carceral systems as well. I was wondering whether someone would ask, or whether we would have a bit of time to talk about things like policing abolition is inextricable from prison abolition, from borders abolition, from abolition of all of the oppressive institutions that seek to control people's behaviour and to sort of further the interests of the state and the government rather than our interests of actual safety and well-being and having our needs met, and sort of prioritising human flourishing within our communities. So yeah, I completely agree that all of those things are very interconnected. As you mentioned, the prison industrial complex. We talk a lot also about the school to prison pipeline these days, and the way that the police are directly involved in putting young people on that pipeline. And the more we have police officers in our schools, the more young people will be criminalised for normal behaviour, and particularly racialised young people, disabled young people, gender diverse young people are most likely to be at risk of this criminalisation. And yeah, it's incredibly harmful. I think I'm sure many of us are supportive of things like no more exclusions and of getting police out of our schools, because I think it's so ironic that I think they call them like safer schools officers. It's like the worst kind of wordplay to cover up what they're actually doing, which is criminalising and perpetrating the harms of the state against young people, particularly marginalised young people. So yeah, I fully think that police abolition is part of a wider kind of abolition project of ending carceral systems and oppressive systems. And I think every book that I've read about any kind of abolition has always also talked about all of those in a very interconnected way. And also many of them are anti-capitalist, because capitalism is a system of harm as well. So yeah, agree.
Thanks, Emmanuelle.
Yeah, I'll just come in really quickly and agree with all of that. In their book, Shanice McBean and Avia Day say abolition is the pre-drinks and revolution is the sesh. And I just think that's such a brilliant articulation of like, this is just the beginning. There's so much building that has to come after it. And I suppose really practically, we have to remain really vigilant, right? As I was talking about, we might be like, oh, okay, we've gotten the police out of schools, but so long as that discriminatory, ableist, racist, sexist, all of the isms remain in the school curriculum, then that carceral logic of policing still is there, right? So I think we have to really be mindful of how those logics repeat themselves and kind of are there in other ways and under other names. And I think a really helpful tool that I always turn to, and which I flashed up on the screen earlier, is that grid of non-reformist reforms. You can really use it to be like, okay, and I think it's intentionally supposed to be practical, right? I think we all should be saying in all the things we do, like, okay, does this do this? Could it do that? Could it do this? And I genuinely think it's that questioning and like, figuring out, getting things wrong that is part of abolition. I think it's often so seen as like, you've got to know all the answers and you've got to get it right. But actually it's a practice of, figuring it all out together. And there are ways that you can do that really carefully and thoughtfully that don't replicate the harm that we're trying to dismantle.
Awesome. Yeah, there's also a book called Against Borders, the case for abolition relating to borders. So I'd recommend looking at that if you're interested specifically to do with borders. There's similar books for other things as well. I'm not going to continue with listing loads of them resources, but I think that point about abolition kind of being across the board and all kind of, we need to work towards abolition for all systems of oppression, basically. overall. Syna.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo the sort of the sentiment of revolution is the sesh. Like, I almost think a lot of the non-reformist reforms, when you work across like in your area, be it education or family systems or like the social care sector, so on and so forth. Like a lot of it is also like about the state has a really big toolbox for maintaining itself. And for like in the state also, like it operates in service of capital. The British state very much like the system, the foundation is this capitalistic mode of production. And then all of the isms, the axes of oppression help to, right, like express specific relations to that production. Revolution being the sesh, how we get there is also like these very suppressed groups have enough, we've taken enough tools out of the toolbox that like help to maintain those systems of oppression. And we've given enough time and space and capacity and resource to different oppressed groups who are the experts in like working towards liberation to drive it home. And that's the revolution and that's the sesh, right? And so thinking about how we actually create enough breathing space in really repressive systems that we all get to the sesh at the same time. Like, that's how I think about the abolition work in lots of diverse ways, is just like, everybody needs enough of the boot off their neck for just long enough. And then like, we all know what we have to do, but we have to like make the space for the actualization of it.
Thank you. That was a really kind of illustrative way of explaining that idea. I love that. Ellie, we have a question from you.
So it was a really great talk and I found a lot of it really interesting. But the main thing I wanted to ask was sort of how to appeal this to a wider group of people. I think the holding our own resource is really good, but it's the middle class white people who are the main drivers of the fear of this and the main drivers for the policy. And although we want revolutionary reform, to achieve democratic reform, you need popular support. And how are you going to sort of educate people with this? Maybe without explaining some more of the theory. I found explaining the history of it quite interesting. I just wanted to know what you thought on methods of that.
Yeah, maybe if I could add to that question, what could the Green Party's role be within this as well? Yeah, does anyone want to take that chunky question? Megan and then Emmanuelle.
I think I'm doing the thing that Syna did earlier where I'm like, I've raised my hand immediately. I'm like, oh, that's a brilliant question. Yes, thank you. And definitely something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. And a big reason for why I organised this event was wanting to talk to more people about these kinds of ideas and finding ways of communicating these ideas that are accessible and approachable to people. I think for me, just to take first of all the question of like, how do we appeal to the middle classes? I think it's really about like questioning what the police actually do and asking these questions about like sort of poking the holes in the status quo idea that the police are here to protect us and say, well, actually, have you ever had to call the police because something happened to you or to someone that you know? And what did happen then? Did they actually do anything useful? Because in my experience, even the middle classes, the vast majority of us have not had positive experiences of policing. I've never bothered to call the police when I've experienced sexual violence. Neither have the vast majority of people I know. The people who I know who have called them have had terrible experiences. So I think that's a sort of a great one to point out. I do think the amount of scandals that have come out recently are really helping to build people's awareness. And I really think that public opinion is shifting away from the acceptance of the idea that the police are here to protect us and keep us safe. So I think this is a great time to be kind of asking these gentle questions and saying, well, what are they actually achieving? What are they doing with their time in our communities? You know, as I gave loads of examples earlier of like what they actually do is, you know, stop and search people, strip search people, help to deport people, all of these like really harmful things, and asking the question of like, are they making actually society better, or are they doing harmful things to people who are already very vulnerable? The other thing I would say is that on one hand, I do agree with you that we do need to win over more white middle class people, but on the other hand, we have a very diverse multiracial working class in that country, in this country, and I think these are the people who are already experiencing the harms of policing disproportionately. And actually, these are the people as well that we need to organise into taking, you know, practical action and building new ways of keeping our communities safe without the police. Sisters Uncut, the grassroots feminist group, do an incredible amount of work on this. I would really recommend everyone to have a look at, to follow them on Twitter and social media and look at what they do. They do a lot of different things, and they talk about withdrawing consent from policing. So not just accepting that the police should be allowed to do whatever they're doing if you walk past and you see them searching someone or arresting someone, but actually getting involved, filming them to keep a record of what's happened, asking the person who's being arrested or searched, are you safe? Telling them their rights, and if you don't know what their rights are, find out, and there's lots of free training available. And yeah, sort of questioning that normalization of the idea that the police are a force that can just do whatever they want in this society because they have the right to do that. Yeah, and things like cop watch groups are springing up around the country. I feel like Ria's nodding like they're about to be like, yes, I was about to say that. Cop watch groups are really important, so they do a similar kind of job, and I think there are other forms of doing this, like when people physically prevent immigration raids. These are the kinds of actions that physically not only demonstrate that we don't consent to policing, but they prevent harmful policing from happening at all, because we've all come together as a community to say, we don't agree with what you're doing. You're not keeping our community safe by trying to deport this person or by searching or arresting this person who's a member of our community. So those are just a few of my points, but I think we'll all have lots to say about that, so I'll stop now.
Emmanuelle.
Thanks. So just a really brief response to this. One answer to the question of, you know, how, like, why should I support this, is what we currently have isn't working. And if we really cared about ending serious youth violence, we'd follow the evidence. Evidence shows us that by reducing police powers, responding to root causes, investing in communities flourish. Like, really simplifying and pointing out that the current turn of events bad, but what we do know works really good. So that's just a really simple and persuasive answer. And I think often what gets us caught off guard is that we don't feel confident, because often it's a lot of information that we're trying to relay. But when you can simplify it for yourself, it like gives you that confidence to be like, it's really simple. Like, why don't you, like, it's such a no-brainer, you know? So like kind of bringing that energy is also really important. The other thing I would say is that I didn't really talk about it that much in my presentation, but we did a lot of messaging and framing research when we were developing the guide and when we were developing how to talk about these issues. So that's another resource that I can make sure everyone gets. Yeah, we really looked at like what frames work and what don't work. We actually found that talking about the word or term safety was one that really doesn't work that well, because as Megan alluded to when she was talking about, or maybe it was Ria, sorry, but when whoever it was talking about safer schools officers, like, it's so ingrained in our imaginations and understandings that police equals safety, that then when you say to people what makes you feel safe, like it automatically makes them think of policing in the criminal justice system and so on. So actually, if you reframe it as like, you know, when have you felt cared for? When do you feel comfortable? Like, really, like, talking about those other values, it really helps people like actually think quite deeply. And that's some of the lessons that we learned from the messaging as well. But I could go on about this. I will stop there. Really great question.
That's really insightful about the messaging, and yeah, keen to kind of get those resources. Syna, and then I don't know if people are okay to continue because we've just gone past quarter past, but yeah, Syna, then we'll wrap up.
I think pragmatically, and I echo everything that was said already from folks, but I often find that abolition is a practice that's like learned through organizing. And so one of the ways, and like organizing itself, right, like it takes a while to get somebody to going from sort of protesting to mutual aid to doing direct action or whatever that pathway looks for an individual. But for the people that you can, like asking people to do more, a little bit. And I actually think, and then feeding a lot of this, again, like abiding by the messaging tips that Emmanuelle has given, feeding folks evidence of all the different ways policing is failing folks along the way. But you will see it firsthand as soon as you become involved in any type of community work, is really the reality. As soon as your boots are on the ground, you will experience it. And so finding the specific non-reformist reform that most appeals to that middle-class English person that is like in your life, and getting them involved in just that non-reformist reform will actually probably highlight abolition more meaningfully for them. And I think that especially with a day job in drugs. There's like so many folks who came to this just because of maybe a libertarian ethos, a sort of like using drugs doesn't hurt anybody. Why should that get policed? And then like you spend a few months sitting there and you're like, oh, wow, this is really shit. And then it's kind of becomes like drinking from a fire hydrant suddenly. On that, one resource I'd flag that I think is really helpful right now and really appeals to the sort of middle class, like false threats to safety, is there's a paper just released in the journal Race and Class called County Lines, Racism, Safeguarding, and Statecraft in Britain, which like does a really good job picking apart the ways in which like county lines is a sort of contrived false threat that police use to justify ongoing racist policing. And I think this is really handy because I think county lines is something that I've heard come up so many times when people talk about, again, the myth of police keeping people safe and who they're keeping safe. And very similar to sex workers, it's young Black boys and young Black men who are being theoretically being like portrayed as the victims, but like if you actually look at what's happening, it is just ongoing criminalization and a lifetime of criminalization in practice. There's no saved victims. There's only villains all the way down. And similarly for sex workers, like it's actually just women who are sex working who are those who are being criminalized all the way down. And so I think that like picking things like that, but also choosing that non-reformist reform and getting people involved is like a really helpful way to sort of shed some light.
Thank you all very much. That was really insightful into kind of like understanding how we can try to change people's minds. I don't know if anyone wants to answer that little bit about what could the Green Party do. Yeah, Megan.
Yeah, so I got distracted by the rest of my answer, and then afterwards I was like, oh yeah, to say that. Yeah, that is also a really important question. And again, a reason why I wanted to put this event together was to get people together to think about how we can, as a party, start to move outside of the status quo on the topic of policing, how we can make space to have serious conversations about the function of policing and the need to build a world where we don't need the police. So I guess firstly through events like this, through creating spaces where people can come together and like talk about and think about new ideas, but also I guess in many ways, so in our policies, in our rhetoric, and in our engagement with communities as well. So to start with the rhetoric, one thing for me is about thinking about how we talk about policing. And at the moment, I think many of us are very stuck in the sort of loop of talking about reform and demanding reform, and reform isn't working. And then we were asking for more reforms or different reforms. And I think sometimes talking about reform so much really just kind of normalizes the idea that policing should exist and should continue to exist, and that that's what we want. And what I would love to see is for Green Party members, Green Party politicians to start using language about policing and talking about things and asking questions that kind of question the need for policing to exist, or question like what the function of policing really is and the fact that it doesn't keep our communities safe. So I think actually talking about this, and not just saying, you know, when are they going to implement the reforms from the Casey review? And I'm kind of like, I don't think they're going to. I don't think that would work if they did. That's the issue that I come up against personally a lot. And yeah, in terms of our policies, I mean, similar to Ria, one of the many reasons why I joined the Green Party, we have a lot of fantastic policies on sex work decrim, drug decrim, you know, universal basic income. A lot of our policies actually they are abolitionist policies that would help to build this new world where people's needs are actually met, where we, center our society and our economy around human flourishing. So I think continuing to make sure that we have policies embedded in the party that really reflect that, and thinking about how we can maybe do that more explicitly, because at the moment it's just kind of a natural thing, but maybe we could talk more clearly about how we're, in doing these things, we're trying to end carceral and oppressive systems like policing and prisons and borders. And again, engagement with communities. I just wanted to mention, I think our London mayoral candidate, Zoe Garbett, does a lot of really great work in Hackney and in Dalston, where she's a councillor, on engaging with communities who experience harmful policing, and kind of supporting them to ask questions about what the police are doing and why, and trying to prevent that from happening as well. So I think that's a really important thing to do, is not to forget about the people that are the most vulnerable to these harms.
Great, thank you. You summarised that so well. And I think that this talk is a starting point. It's not kind of just a one-off. It's kind of to start a conversation within the Green Party and a discussion as to how we can work to get more types of abolitionist policies. And Megan, as you mentioned, like there are already some policies that some people might consider abolitionist, but maybe we haven't explicitly sold it as such, but it's a starting point and we can continue this conversation. But to wrap this up, thank you all so much for coming along. Thank you to all three of our wonderful speakers as well for taking the time to come along, and we hope to do some future events discussing similar topics, so do keep an eye out on your emails for that, and we will send around a list of resources as well that we've been mentioning today. We've mentioned a lot of resources, but I've kept a track of all of them, so I will collate them and we can send them out as well as the recording. But thank you everybody so much, and have a good rest of your night. Bye.